tremendous amount of expertise in implementing standards for sustainable finance, and that includes a foundation of environmental and social risk management, which is very aligned with ISSB. So ISSB's approach to materiality is very similar to the way IFC would work in an investment. So IFC focuses on project finance in emerging markets, but also a range of other different types of finance and finances through banks. So we're very familiar with helping banks establish the systems to manage environmental and social and governance risk. So with that in mind, these regulators from emerging markets asked us to support them as they learn from each other and develop national frameworks that require these standards. We're about to launch our global progress report. So I think Tuesday is the launch date. We do a global progress report every 2 years. And there will be the most recent data on what is actually happening across different countries. But I can already tell you that 48 countries have launched more than 400 policies or principles that support sustainable finance. So that can be a national roadmap for sustainable finance, green bond guidelines or regulations, requirements for banks to implement environmental and social risk management, and then reporting to the regulators. So this space has emerged and evolved significantly over the past decade, and that's going to impact the real sector, the private sector that is seeking finance. And it also has an impact increasingly on things like green bond issuances or green social and sustainability bond issuances, or green social and sustainability focused loans or transition finance. So these are all the new types of instruments that we're seeing emerge. But at a foundation, what we talk about in terms of sustainable finance when we work with regulators and banking associations, sustainable finance is the 2 dimensions: improving environmental, social, and governance risk management of financial sector activities, including climate change risks. So climate change is one of the big priorities that everyone's focusing on, but it sits in a very well-established foundation of ESG risk management. And then increasing capital flows to activities with positive environmental and social impacts, including mitigating and adapting to climate change. And that directing the capital flows, you want to know that they're going to activities that really are credible in terms of their environmental and social impact. And that also has that environmental and social risk management component. We look at the full spectrum of sustainable finance. So Joseph mentioned that we have climate finance, climate bonds, transition finance, but also a number of other environmental topics and social topics are getting very popular, particularly in emerging markets. So under climate financing, we see mitigation finance. So how do you finance behaviors by the private sector to reduce greenhouse gas emissions or increase carbon sinks so that we can mitigate the impact of climate change? And how do you finance a transition? So this is interesting for entities that want to get this kind of finance. You might not be green right now, but having a plan to become greener over time, and particularly under climate change, reducing greenhouse gas emissions, that plan, if it's credible, is a way to attract financing. So there's more attention being paid to what is a good transition plan. But then climate change adaptation is hugely important, and that's wide open in terms of innovation. And then we see things like blue finance, so investing in oceans, water infrastructure. Biodiversity has become very popular with things like the Task Force on Nature-related Financial Disclosures. So being able to assess the impacts on ecosystems and nature and try to make those positive rather than negative. But under social, we see things like financial inclusion, investment in SMEs, investment in women-owned businesses, health, education. So a range of social topics, and then governance and good governance being a key area where you can strengthen the financial performance of the business while you're improving the governance and then their ability to manage risks. So what does it look like in terms of trends? Because this is going to impact everybody. So the regulators across the SBFN countries, you can see in 2013, there was very little in place. But since then, so in the past 10 years, we've seen a massive increase in terms of regulators, financial sector regulators bringing in these requirements. And eventually it touches on disclosure. So the benchmarking system that we use to assess, to compare countries, because we were asked by our members to compare countries. So we have a systematic approach, and this is focused on the financial sector, but it's useful for you as accountants to understand that this is the thinking that informs the way the banks are approaching financial risk and financial impact and sustainability impact, so sustainability risk and impact. So pillar one is what we call ESG integration, and that is your foundation of environmental, social, and governance risk management. And the idea is that every entity should have systems to assess and manage environmental and social risks, and that includes at the governance level. So the board should have competencies, senior management should have competencies and responsibilities to identify the key environmental and social risks and manage them. And if you hear the way I'm talking, this is exactly the way ISSB approaches it, is what is the process that the entity uses to assess those risks, and then what are the systems that are put in place to manage those risks. So that is the foundation of ESG integration. We then created a second pillar on climate and nature-related risk management, because this kind of takes things to a next level. And there were new tools that the banks needed to use. For instance, they need to be able to do stress testing or assess the risks in their portfolio where they are exposed to highly polluting industries versus industries that are green and therefore desirable. And so there's different ways this is being done in different countries. But the point being that the competency to assess climate and nature-related risks at a systems level, so whatever your entity is, how do you impact climate change? How do you impact ecosystem services? Even from a single materiality lens, there are financial risks associated for the investor. So for the investor, they're thinking about reputational risk, they're thinking about fines, license to operate, and responses from stakeholders. So investors tend to blend the single and double materiality in many respects. And then finally, financing sustainability. So this is where we look at what are the trends in terms of new opportunities for finance. And you may be aware that companies are tapping into a lot of these new instruments. So if you're looking to get a sustainability-focused loan from a bank, you're going to look at what are your environmental and social positive contributions. So is it on the social side? Is it on the environmental side? And then the bank may want to give you a preferential loan based on your commitment to an environmental impact. So that's the more complex side of things, but now it gets a little bit simpler. But these are the elements that we're tracking. We also look at the maturity over time of countries in terms of putting in place the system. So we're just tracking what's happening. This is not a ranking in any respect. We're just seeing where on the journey the various countries are. And what is key is once there's a framework for defining what sustainable finance is and encouraging banks to adopt these systems, a key component to check whether this is working is disclosure. So we see in the implementation phase, as countries move from developing to advancing, there's more supervision and requirement for banks to disclose how they're implementing these frameworks, but then also how does that look in terms of the percentage of loans that are green or sustainable and the ones that have risk associated with them. And we are seeing a link between green loans and lower credit risk. So there's some countries like China and Bangladesh where they see a strong link between green loans, so a company that is a recipient of a green loan and is also a lower credit risk. So this is still early days to find out what are the causal links, but this is key. So it really is useful when we get this data and banks can start to see where is the business case for sustainability so that they can encourage their clients to focus on the right things. And that's where materiality comes in, is focusing on what is material to your business. And the Harvard research showed this almost 10 years ago, that if you focus on what's material to your business, then there's financial outperformance. If you focus on things that are not material to your business, there can be financial underperformance. And this research was done based on SASB. You'll see, I think SASB is one of the logos here, I think in 2011. The SASB, the Sustainable Accounting Standards Board, came up with sector standards that show you what are the material issues for that sector. So that's a great tool for you to use to figure out what is material to your business. And then you can see ISSB has definitely helped to bring together a lot of these requirements and harmonize how everybody is talking about disclosure. So what does it look like for us? This is the ecosystem of disclosure requirements that we're looking at from the sustainable finance perspective. So I've talked a little bit about the banking sector regulations and voluntary principles. So we're seeing more of that come in. So the banks have to report. And then we have capital markets requirements, which impact the private sector more broadly. And at the moment, these things are not entirely harmonized. So we'll have capital markets disclosure, but we're looking at how this can support banking supervision. And then finally, below, we have disclosure on requirements related to sustainable finance instruments. This is the bonds and the loans, etc., that have sustainability criteria. And you may have heard this new term taxonomies come in, which is the way that countries are classifying what constitutes green or socially focused finance. And what's useful for you to know is if you as an entity are looking to issue a green bond or sustainability bond, you have to do a prospectus that explains how do you align with green and social bond criteria, such as provided by ICMA, the International Capital Market Association. But in that, you have to manage environmental and social risk as well. So your ISSB system, your ISSB disclosure is going to feed into that. And in the context of taxonomies, there's specific requirements for do no significant harm to environmental objectives and minimum social safeguards. So again, if you have these systems in place, it's going to be much easier for you to demonstrate alignment with those criteria. And very quickly, I think I'm going to wrap up very soon, but to give you a kind of a flavor in terms of the things that the banking sector is being asked to track across different countries. So we compared 9 different countries in terms of their reporting requirements for banks. And you can see it's a split between asking the banks about their own ESG management versus how are they financing sustainability in terms of opportunities, how do they manage risk in their portfolios, what their corporate governance approach is, and then how do they do climate risk assessment and management. This is what the banks are being asked. And this gives you a flavor of what are the things that are at the top of the agenda. So the banks are being asked about their own working conditions and diversity in the workplace, followed by environmental footprint. And then under corporate governance, very strong focus on how is the bank managing their governance of ESG, and do they have a sustainability policy? Under ESG risk in the portfolio, they're asked how they're doing on ESG screening and categorization of risk. And then under financing sustainability, green finance is still the most popular, but we see financial inclusion and women-led finance also very, very popular. These are the different documents that are being used for finance providers to find this data about entities. So annual reports, bond prospectuses are a big part of this. And I think that's useful for you to know. And then summary of investment information is a very small component. So IFC and other development finance institutions will actually publish an overview of the proposed investment. And then just a taste of the topics that are coming up. So this is looking at using artificial intelligence to actually track what are the topics that are coming up as material. So talking about materiality, what are the topics that perhaps have the most negative sentiment? And you've got things like involuntary resettlement. So if you're a company that's involuntarily resettling communities for development, that's going to come up as a major risk. And then pollution, climate, worker safety, etc. And maybe just to close off the challenges and opportunities for our members, they're interested in supporting convergence on indicators across the main ESG themes. So they're very supportive of how to pull in ISSB, as well as there's new financial sector standards being developed by GRI. And they want to build the link between banking supervision and capital markets. They understand that there's a cost associated with key data points like GHG emissions and climate-related risks. So they're aware of that. That tends to be the highest cost center. And there will need to be time for banks to adopt these practices and align with frameworks. So I'm going to stop there. Thank you, Joseph. Happy to take questions or respond to anything. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Louise, what a fantastic session. There are no questions yet that have come through, but as soon as the questions do come up, I'll put them to you. Thank you also for deciding to stay till the end of the session. So I did hear from people on the call that some elements of the presentation didn't start up on LinkedIn early enough. So I'll try and just provide some context there. So just for the benefit of doubt, you just heard from Louise, and Louise is one of our experts, and she provided that lens from an IFC perspective in terms of sustainable finance work group there and what they are doing in terms of helping practitioners with ESG disclosure transitioning, but more importantly around the financing, climate finance and what have you. And for us as accountants, that's very important when we think about cost of capital and the various sources of finance for our organization. Climate finance is one of such, and so she has dealt with that fully. For the benefit of that, those just joining us, I see there's a lot of people just joining. Again, I've just put up the barcode and the community that we're creating to be able to talk about this going forward. So please do scan this barcode and make sure that you are able to join that community, and going forward you'll be able to share different things with you as we go. Also note that every day there's obviously a different link to joining, and that might have created some confusion for a lot of you on the call today. So every day I'll be putting up the link and sharing that on LinkedIn. So this today obviously is day 2 link, but this group will remain after the challenge. So please take out your phones, the 40 or so of you on the call currently, and please scan this so that you can request to be invited to the group to join, and subsequently we'll be able to engage in that. And so in terms of green financing, Louise has touched on a lot of this already. For us as accountants, it's thinking about not mitigation, adaptation, but more importantly, how much resources is needed to address climate change. So the number of sources, some will say 400 to 600 billion per year across the world, but we do know that various sustainable projects are required. So in places like Pakistan, Africa, and other emerging markets, you see a lot of solar farms, a number of that in Senegal, in Morocco, in Nigeria, coming up to help, improve the diversity on the grid, the electricity grid, to make sure that it's not just, power from coal and from, fossil fuel generated energy. So solar projects are common in those continents. In other parts of the world, green buildings are also coming up. Transportation, green transportation, rapid bus transit, especially in very densely populated cities around the world. Those are projects you continue to see, and these attract most of the funding for green finance. Also, green policies. When it comes to public sector, governments around the world are thinking about how they meet social needs by ensuring that they do take into consideration sustainable development at its best. I won't talk too much about mitigation. I know Louise has talked about that, but definitely we need to reduce the greenhouse gases, which have the corresponding effect on the temperature. So in places like Australia, even in Europe, we've seen the past summers have been very, very dry and hot, right? And the temperatures have really been, unbearable for humans. and that will continue until we start doing those shifts. Again, when it comes to adaptation, we're thinking about what are the mechanisms, the interventions that are needed to ensure that we don't continue to have all those financial losses. In 2022 alone, over 620 billion US was lost to all of the catastrophes we saw. In Australia, many people died. Over 40 lost over 1 billion animals, right, in Australia, and many more financial losses, buildings, and all of that were damaged due to the bushfires we had here. The same in California and other parts of the world. And when you think about adaptation, you're thinking about food security. So all over the world, you're now seeing that there's now a lot of emphasis on how do we ensure that we have enough food to feed the booming population growth that we've seen over the last few years. If you have 7+ billion people on the earth, then there is need to ensure that they have access to adequate and nutritious food. When we think about opportunities and risk, not just from financial instrument perspective, I'll touch on these when I get into IFRS S1 itself. You also need to think about it from a strategic point of view. So for places like Africa, like I mentioned, across South Asia, Pakistan, Bangladesh, India, when you're thinking about foreign direct inflows, you need to think about how to potentially be the center that would attract some of these funds that is moving around the world. And Luis has mentioned that, when donors and investors and funds are looking for projects around the world, now they are even thinking about more sustainable projects, sustainability inclined projects that have sustainable development goals as part of their strategy. And so as an organization, as a finance person, when you're working with your organization or with public sector and helping them to think about these issues to ensure that their projects are aligned, would help them attract funding. Greenwashing, blue washing has also become very common. Now with sustainability being all over the place, you find that organizations are now making assertions that may not necessarily be true about their operations, about their projects. And so we as finance people are the ones that need to ensure that these projects and these assertions are valid. And they will still bring into focus the talk around assurance. And I know even for the ISSB, it's about providing, when they put out the standard, it's about providing information that would be relevant for investors. But more importantly, the information should be assurable. So assurance will become even more pivotal for organizations that make claims around non-financial reporting. So when we think about non-financial reporting and assurance, there are different types of assurance. And from a financial reporting, we know, depending on the level of rigor of an assurance program, it will determine the level of assurance you can give. We've got positive and negative assurance. Many students of financial reporting can still remember that. But, in terms of procedures, you also have things like agreed upon procedures and up to a full-blown audit. So when you're doing a full-blown audit, like you remember, it will be around providing a reasonable assurance to users of our financial statement. Where the procedures are not as rigorous, then you can settle for a limited form of assurance. So whatever level of rigor you want to give those non-financial information, it's important that you are able to also show that they've gone through that assurance process. The assurance standard setters globally are also working on a sustainability assurance standard that they hope to also be able to release to help with this process. I've put in some screenshots here from the Green Bond guidelines. This is very popular among the asset managers, reserve banks, and lenders around the world. They use these principles to provide assurance for the issuance they do on some of their climate bonds and what have you. CBI is also a common one. Rubicola is part of a CBI verification. And what they do is to ensure that whatever bond, green bonds that they certify or approve have gone through that rigorous process where a verifier, you can think of the verifier in this case as an auditor. In financial statement preparation, we call, the auditor will provide the assurance. So for CBI, they've termed their auditor verifiers. Okay, and their certification process obviously involves what they call the pre-issuance and then, a post-issuance certification. Someone has asked the question, Morenike says, is there a threshold for assurance? There's currently no threshold. So for those that release sustainability reports, for organizations that currently have sustainability report, you notice that because it's a nice to have in most jurisdictions, they are not currently requirements. Before the ISSB, most organizations that have been issuing sustainability reports have done that because of their stakeholders or because of investor pressure. A number of them, several of them, would have done assurance, but currently a lot of those reports are not assured. What you will find, the hope of the ISSB is that when you start implementing the IFRS S1 and S2, you would get assurance for this. So going into the future, there will be need for assurance, especially for the listed entities, right, that have that investor, pressure to meet and other stakeholders. So I hope that answers your question, Morenike. So this is an example of a solar project for the CBI verification scheme. And these are eligible activities that would qualify. And these are some of the things the verifier would want to, ensure completeness around before they can give that, report to say that that project is indeed, ready for funds in terms of green bond issuance. If we put that aside for a moment, I know we've got just about 15 minutes, but I want to use the remaining time we have today to delve into the financial reporting lens and introduce you to IFRS S1. Tomorrow, we'll finalize with S2 and some of the reporting requirements and challenges that you'll expect over the next few months. But just taking you back some 50 years ago, half a century now, was when the IASC was actually formed. It was established by several countries. Remember, the IASC is the precursor body to the IASB. So it was called in 1973, and in the 80s, it was called the International Accounting Standards Committee, a council back then. And it was formed by several committees. And the intention was to, publish, high quality, globally acceptable standards, single set of standards. And obviously, in the 80s, they would continue their work. But the key milestone for the IASC was when, the entire European Union decided to adopt IFRS some years back in the early 2000s. And the rest is history. From South Africa to across Africa and all of the world, we now have 140 jurisdictions around the world that use IFRS. In fact, the IOSCO, also the International Organization for Securities Commission, endorsed IFRS for all of its member bodies around the world. But the IASB or the IASC, however you look at this, would not have achieved this goal without the support of national standard setters. So in each of these countries, you still have national standard setters that have either aligned their local standards or converged it, like we've seen with the US, to the IFRS, or just adopted the IFRS as it is. And that has helped with the evolution of the financial reporting standards before we now add the ISSB coming into play. When we think about the IFRS S1, we're looking at, how to enable companies communicate to investors globally in terms of having comparability and comprehensive information. So note those two words. Before now, there was divergent guidelines, GRI, SASB, CDP, UN Global Compact, many of those standards or guidelines. And each country would just choose any or a few that they will use. However, the intention is that going forward, when you adopt the ISSB IFRS S1, you'll be able to communicate to investors. The focus of the ISSB is on investors. Like I mentioned yesterday, this is significantly different from where GRI stands. So GRI is a global reporting initiative. I mentioned yesterday that currently they control between 60 to 70% of the market. So most of the entities that report on sustainability disclosures would be using GRI. GRI and the European standards in terms of sustainability reporting standard are focused on double materiality. However, for the ISSB, they've narrowed that to just an investor focus. And that means that they are more interested in that financial materiality, which we are used to. An item is material if it's omission, or error, or in it would affect or impact decision makers, decision in terms of their investment in an organization. So that's the concept of materiality that is adopted here. But the key thing is to be able to communicate those sustainability-related information in a cost-effective manner. And they did this by developing globally sustainability-related disclosures that are assurable to meet the need of investors. So the ISSB has also placed a significant focus on assurance. That's also pivotal, right? It's strategic because in the past, when you have all these entities issuing their financial or sustainability information, like I mentioned, they did not focus on audit, right? But going into the future, there's an element of this that requires that you will also perform some form of assurance. And as we follow closely, the global assurance standards setting bodies, when they come up with their sustainability assurance framework and standards, we would also expect that most organizations will follow that. So when you think about IFRS S1, what should come to mind? It is critical to note that for S1, it's about material disclosures. So you note that what you find in some of the sustainability reports currently are just disclosures. Ideally, when you're preparing a sustainability report, you should also think about materiality, have a stakeholder session, understand what are the material issues. But it's not impossible, or it's not unlikely that you find that some of the reports that organizations are currently producing might not necessarily be material. So as accountants, we need to put on that lens. And when you think about materiality in terms of the ISSB, remember, it's on financial materiality. So you want to ensure that information you'll be disclosing going forward under the IFRS S1 will be material information about sustainability-related risks and opportunities. So those are the only things that you should consider including in your financial statement. And when you think about this, you can follow, or you should follow, the TCFD architecture. I mentioned on the platform yesterday that the Task Force on Climate-Related Financial Disclosures, TCFD, was the first attempt to reconcile all the divergent guidelines and standards around the world. And they have now been subsumed into the ISSB. But they have this architecture, which we'll look at closely in a bit, which focuses on governance, the governance arrangements that you have as an organization, the strategy with which you want to deliver and address some of the issues in terms of your risk and opportunities, and your risk management approach, as well as KPIs, metrics, and targets that you set for yourself as an organization. So it's easy for the ISSB to rely on this spiral work of the TCFD. And so you find that for entities that have already adopted TCFD, it's easier for them to transition into the ISSB new set of standards. Also, there's a focus on industry-specific disclosures. So as an organization, you need to think about what other peers in the industry are disclosing. And that's where the SASB comes in. Sustainability Accounting Standards, which are mainly used in the US before now. Again, they are now part of the ISSB architecture. You can look into the SASB disclosures to look for specific industry standards, sustainability standards, that will help you think about what are the disclosures that are necessary for your industry. It's important to note that when you're thinking about IFRS S1, you're only thinking about sustainability-related information. Anything that has to do with the climate would be part of IFRS S2, and we'll look at that tomorrow. So when we talk about the TCFD structure, this slide captures everything you need to think about in terms of the content. So like every standard, you have the scope, the objective, the scope, and judgment, and all of those things you would expect in a normal IFRS standard. But in terms of content, what you would, the content of your report should have when it comes to IFRS S1, these are the core elements of the content. So you need to think about the governance structure in your organization. What processes have you put in place? What controls, what procedures have you put in place in terms of governance that would enable you to be able to, implement, this non-financial disclosures that will enable you to capture and have appropriate board oversight over the entire process of sustainability as well as climate risk related issues. When you think about strategy, it's about the corporates, the tone at the top. What's the strategy? What's the outlook for the organization in terms of managing risk and opportunity? So as we know, there are specific risks that will pertain to an entity, to a company, depending on your industry. So if you're in the extractive industry, you're an oil and gas player, then we know that there's the risk of stranded assets. All of your investments on rigs, if you're an oil and gas, you're Shell, you're Chevron, BHP, all of those big international oil companies, the smaller players, all of them would have the risk of stranded assets. So all those assets that you've invested huge amounts of resources, investment over the years, might be impaired. So as an organization, you need to think about your strategy. How do you manage this risk? I mentioned yesterday that a number of those players, Shell, Total, have started divesting from some of that investment and thinking about their future and going into new investments in renewables and all of that. That might be what works for them. For other entities, that might not be the case. You need to think about that. In parts of Africa and other emerging markets, there's still refineries being constructed because there's huge deficit when it comes to energy supply, right? So you need to think about that. What's the trade-offs for you as an organization? Also, you need to consider what are the risk management approach you put in place. How do you identify risk? How do you assess those risks? How do you prioritize the risk and monitor this risk as an organization? So your risk management approach, the enterprise-wide risk management needs to be updated. You need to upskill that to be able to deal with the requirements of the new standard in terms of IFRS S1. Last but not the least, also you need to think about your corporate performance and how it relates to metrics and targets. So you need to set, appropriate KPIs, in terms of your emissions, your scope 1, your scope 2, your scope 3 emissions. So it's not just enough to think about your own operations. You need to think about scope 3. For financial services, they have, financed emissions. So if you're giving loans or raising financial instruments, or you hold loan notes for organizations that, have high GHG, greenhouse gas emissions, then you also need to think about the impact of that to you and how you communicate that to your shareholders. So that's the core of IFRS S1. Tomorrow we'll talk about some of the transition, exemptions that have been given to enable first-time adopters adopt the standards. But we'll leave it there for today. If there are questions, I'll take that before we go. Morenike, I can see you have a question there. Okay, someone said, okay, the sites are not moving. Sorry about that. We'll share that after the session. Morenike said, is there any incentive to how much a government is willing to grant or support an organization? Are there incentives? Yeah, there are a number of organizations that provide incentives to different players depending on where you are in. So you need to think about, obviously, the likes of IFC. It could be loans, it could be grants. Africa Development Bank, Asia Development Bank. Sometimes they have all of this interventions locally. The governments also in places like the US are providing incentives for innovation. So in the EV, electric vehicle space, there's a lot of grants to just encourage competition. So it's not just the big guys and Tesla alone, but other guys coming into that space. So I hope that answers your question, Morenike. Any other questions before we go? We've got three minutes. Okay, thank you again for joining. If there are no more questions, tomorrow is the final day. We'll look at IFRS S2, and more importantly, we'll also look at the transition exemptions, as well as some of the challenges and project management dimension to the transition that you need to think about as a financial controller, as a CFO, as a finance person. If there are risk specialists on the call, if you're also a risk specialist, or you're part of your investor com or comms department in your organization, what are the issues that you need to think about in terms of transitioning as an organization? So thank you to everyone that joined today. We'll leave the link again for day 3 for you to see when you dial in tomorrow. Just go on to the page and you will see the day 3 link there, and we'll also share on LinkedIn so that you don't have the challenge you had today. A number of you had challenges joining us today, but I'm sure you'll be able to see the replay on LinkedIn for those that joined late. So thank you so much. Also, a big thank you to Luis for joining, and I'll see you all tomorrow. So yes, that's goodbye from us. Thank you for joining.